King Alaric had not bowed his head in 20 years. His reign was built on absolute fear, but in a freezing, muddy alley, the ruthless sovereign halted. A fragile, blind woman in ruined rags lay shivering in the icy muck. She could not see the terrifying shadow towering over her. She only reached out a trembling hand into the howling wind. "Please," she whispered, "could you help me up?" Alaric could have easily walked away. Instead, the heavy iron joints of his armor groaned as the Alpha King slowly dropped to his knees in the dirt. And then, the starving beggar reached into her torn dress and offered the most dangerous man alive her last piece of stale bread. King Alaric rode through the market square of Oakhaven. Rain turned the cobblestones into treacherous mud. Soldiers flanked him on both sides. No citizen dared to look up. They pressed their faces against the wet ground. Alaric had not lost a battle in 20 years. He had not bowed his head since his father died. Men called him ruthless. He considered himself necessary. His armor clanked with every step of his warhorse. The winter air bit at his exposed face. He ignored the cold. A sharp crack echoed from beneath his horse. The beast stumbled. Alaric pulled the reins tight. He steadied the animal with practiced ease. A horseshoe lay fractured in the freezing mud. He ordered his men to halt. He swung down from the saddle. His boots hit the ground with a heavy thud. The mud splashed against his iron greaves. He signaled his captain to fetch the farrier. He preferred to wait in the narrow alley, away from the groveling crowd. The shadows here offered a brief respite from the stares of the defeated. Wind howled through the narrow stone passages. He pulled his heavy wool cloak tighter around his shoulders. A faint rustling sound caught his attention. He rested his hand on his sword hilt. He stepped deeper into the gloom. A figure crouched near the frozen gutter. It was a woman. Her clothes hung in ragged tatters. She was shivering violently. Her hands scraped blindly against the ice. She seemed to be searching for something. Alaric watched her in silence. He noticed her eyes. They were clouded with a milky white haze. She could not see him. She could not see anything. Her fingers brushed against a small wooden bowl. It slipped from her frozen grasp. The bowl clattered away into a deep puddle. She let out a soft sigh. It was not a sound of despair. It was merely quiet resignation. She tried to push herself up. Her thin arms trembled under her own weight. Her knees slipped on the slick stones. She fell hard against the icy wall. A low gasp escaped her lips. Alaric did not move. Pity was a useless emotion to him. He had seen thousands suffer. He had caused much of that suffering himself. He had spent his life crushing weakness. Weakness invited death. His father had taught him that lesson with a heavy hand. He had survived by becoming harder than stone. He intended to turn and walk back to his horse. Then she turned her head toward the sound of his armored steps. She did not cower. She did not shrink away in fear. She simply faced the dark shape she could hear. "Is someone there?" she asked. Her voice was hoarse. It carried a strange calmness. Alaric remained silent. He wondered if she would realize who he was by the smell of oiled steel and leather. She dragged herself upright against the wall. Her legs failed her again. She slid back down into the freezing water. She did not cry. She just leaned her head back and caught her breath. Alaric took one step forward. His spurs scraped loudly against a stone. She tilted her head. "I dropped my bowl," she said. She pointed vaguely toward the puddle. "I cannot find it in the mud." Alaric looked at the cheap wooden object. It was worthless. He looked back at her frail form. He should leave. His men were waiting. The kingdom demanded his attention, yet his feet remained planted. "It is in the water," he finally spoke. His voice was a deep, gravelly rumble. It usually made grown men tremble. She offered a small, tired smile. "Thank you," she said. She did not ask him to fetch it. She began to crawl toward the sound of his voice. Her hands sank into the freezing muck. Alaric felt a strange tightness in his chest. He had broken kings and executed traitors. He did not know how to handle this quiet dignity. She bumped her shoulder against a wooden barrel. She gasped and held her side. Pain etched across her dirt-streaked face. She tried to stand one more time. Her ankle buckled completely. She collapsed near his boots. The hem of her ruined dress brushed against his iron greaves. She rested there for a moment. The rain began to fall harder. It washed the dirt from her pale cheeks. She slowly raised her head. She reached out a trembling hand. Her fingers found empty air. She searched until she brushed against the edge of his thick cloak. She did not pull it. She merely held the coarse fabric as an anchor. "Sir," she whispered. The word cut through the howling wind. Alaric looked down at her. He stood towering over her broken form. He could end her misery with one strike. He could walk away and forget she existed. "I have no strength left," she said. Her blind eyes looked straight through his armor. They seemed to pierce something he had buried long ago. She squeezed the edge of his cloak. "Please," she asked, "could you help me up?" Alaric stared at the frail hand gripping his cloak. Rainwater dripped from the edge of his iron helmet. 20 years had passed since he last bent his knee for anyone. Kings did not stoop to the mud. Conquerors did not concern themselves with fallen beggars. His mind commanded him to pull his cloak away and leave. His body refused to obey. The woman shivered violently against the stone wall. Her knuckles turned stark white from the freezing cold. She waited with quiet patience. She did not beg twice. Alaric slowly lowered his center of gravity. The joints of his armor groaned in the quiet alley. He knelt into the freezing muck. Mud immediately soaked through his heavy trousers. He did not care. He reached out and grasped her forearms. Her bones felt dangerously fragile beneath his leather gauntlets. She weighed almost nothing. He pulled her upward with slow and deliberate care. He made sure not to bruise her skin. She gasped as her feet found the slippery cobblestones again. Her legs wobbled beneath her. Alaric kept his firm grip on her arms. He waited until she found her balance. "Thank you," she breathed out. Her chest heaved with the effort of standing. She did not pull away from his grasp. She leaned into his support just enough to stay upright. "You are freezing," Alaric said. His voice sounded harsher than he intended. She offered that same small smile. "Winter is rarely kind to those without a hearth," she replied. She reached up to brush wet hair from her face. Her fingers accidentally grazed the cold steel of his breastplate. She paused. Her blind eyes widened slightly in realization. "You wear heavy armor," she murmured. She traced the edge of the metal with a light touch. "You must be one of the soldiers passing through." Alaric did not correct her. He let her believe whatever made her comfortable. "We have had a long march," he simply said. "The war has been hard on everyone," she said softly. She finally pulled her arms free from his hold. She swayed for a second before steadying herself against the wall. She reached deep into the pocket of her ruined dress. Her hands moved with frantic purpose. Alaric watched her with silent curiosity. He wondered if she was searching for a stolen coin. Instead, she pulled out a small cloth bundle. It was tied with a frayed piece of twine. Her stiff fingers struggled with the knot. She finally pulled the fabric apart. Inside lay a single piece of stale, dark bread. It was barely larger than a man's thumb. She held it out toward his chest. "Take this," she offered. Alaric froze. He stared at the pathetic scrap of food. His army carried wagons filled with salted meat and fresh grain. He dined on roasted fowl and rich wine every evening. Yet this starving woman was offering him her only meal. "I cannot take that," Alaric said firmly. She pushed her hand forward again. "You sounded tired," she insisted. Her voice carried a gentle stubbornness. "Soldiers freeze in the mud just like beggars do." She pressed the bread against his armor. "Eat it before the damp ruins it." Alaric slowly raised his hand. He took the hard bread from her palm. The crust was rough against his calloused skin. A strange warmth blossomed in his chest. It was a feeling he had not experienced in decades. No one had offered him anything without expecting land or gold in return. This woman had nothing. She still chose to give. "What is your name?" he asked. "Alara," she answered. She folded her arms across her chest to trap her meager body heat. Footsteps splashed heavily at the end of the alley. "My lord!" a voice called out in a panic. Captain Thorne rounded the corner with his hand on his sword. He stopped dead in his tracks. His mouth fell open in sheer disbelief. He saw the feared ruler of the continent standing in deep mud. He saw the king holding a piece of beggar's bread. Thorne took a hesitant step forward. "Sire, the farrier is ready," the captain stammered. Alara tilted her head at the title. Confusion washed over her pale features. "Sire," she whispered. She took a clumsy step backward. Her heel caught on a loose stone. Alaric dropped the bread into his pouch. He reached out and caught her waist before she could fall again. He shot a murderous glare at his captain. Thorne instantly clamped his mouth shut. The soldier bowed his head and backed away toward the main street. Alaric turned his attention back to the trembling woman. "He spoke to you," Alara said. Her breathing quickened with sudden fear. "You are not just a soldier." "I am a man who was asked for help," Alaric replied evenly. He kept his arms securely around her. He could feel the violent shivers racking her spine. She was moments away from freezing to death. Leaving her here was a death sentence. He had handed down countless death sentences in his reign. This was the first time he refused to allow one. "Where is your home?" he asked. Alara shook her head blindly. "The tavern owner lets me sleep in the stable," she mumbled. "Not tonight," Alaric stated. His tone brokered no argument. "You will freeze in a stable." "I have nowhere else," she said. Her voice cracked with exhausted despair. Alaric adjusted his grip on her. He unfastened the heavy wool cloak from his own shoulders. The bitter wind immediately bit through his tunic. He ignored the chill. He wrapped the thick fabric tightly around Alara. The cloak was large enough to swallow her completely. It smelled of smoke and leather. She gasped at the sudden, heavy warmth. Her hands instinctively grabbed the edges of the wool. "I cannot take this," she protested weakly. "You already have," Alaric said. He stepped to her side. He placed her hand resting on his armored forearm. "Walk with me," he instructed. Alira hesitated in the freezing rain. She did not know this man's true identity. She only knew the safety of his steady presence. She tightened her grip on his arm. They began to walk slowly out of the dark alley. Captain Thorne waited nervously at the edge of the street. The captain watched in stunned silence. Alaric guided the blind beggar through the mud. He adjusted his long strides to match her faltering steps. The townspeople still knelt in the market square. They peeked through their fingers in absolute shock. Their merciless king was acting as a guide for the lowest among them. Alaric ignored the stares. He focused only on the woman leaning against his side. He would find the inn. He would secure the warmest room they had. He realized he was no longer thinking about the war. He was only thinking about keeping her alive. Alaric led Alira toward the center of the town. The rain turned to sleet against the stone buildings. They stopped before a large wooden door. A rusted sign swung above the entrance. Alaric kicked the door open with his boot. The heavy wood crashed against the inside wall. The tavern grew completely silent. Patrons froze with their wooden lugs half raised. The innkeeper dropped right to the floor. Everyone recognized the man standing in the doorway. Alaric ignored the terrified patrons. He guided Alara into the dim room. The smell of stale ale and roasted meat hung in the air. Alara gripped his arm tighter. She could sense the sudden shift in the room. The absolute silence made her nervous. "Is something wrong?" she whispered. "No," Alaric replied. He looked directly at the innkeeper. The plump man scrambled out from behind the counter. He bowed so low his forehead nearly touched the floor. "My lord," the innkeeper stammered. Alaric did not offer a greeting. "I need your best room," Alaric demanded. "Of course," the innkeeper said quickly. He grabbed an iron key from a hook on the wall. "The large room on the second floor is empty." Alaric nodded once. He guided Alara toward the wooden stairs. Her wet boots slipped on the first step. Alaric caught her elbow firmly. He adjusted his pace to match her cautious movements. They reached the top of the landing. The innkeeper hurried ahead to unlock the heavy door. He pushed it open and stepped aside. Alaric led Alara inside. He dismissed the innkeeper with a wave of his hand. The door clicked shut behind them. The room was cold but dry. A large stone hearth dominated the far wall. Alaric walked Alara to a wooden chair near the fireplace. "Sit," he instructed. Alara slowly lowered herself onto the hard wood. She pulled his oversized cloak tighter around her chest. She was still shivering. Alaric walked over to the hearth. He picked up several split logs from a woven basket. He arranged them over the old embers. He struck a piece of flint against steel. A spark caught the dry kindling. Flames quickly licked up the sides of the dry wood. Warmth began to radiate into the freezing room. Alaric stood up and turned around. Alara leaned toward the sound of the crackling fire. Her pale face glowed in the orange light. She reached her hands out toward the warmth. Her fingers were still stiff and red. "You need to remove your wet clothes," Alaric said. Alara lowered her hands. She looked suddenly vulnerable. "I have nothing else to wear," she admitted. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Alaric walked to the heavy oak bed in the corner. He pulled a thick woolen blanket from the mattress. He carried it back to the fire. He placed the folded blanket gently on her lap. "Use this," he said. Alara touched the dry wool. A look of deep relief crossed her face. "Thank you," she said. Alaric turned his back to her. He faced the heavy window shutters. He listened to the storm raging outside. He heard the rustle of his heavy cloak sliding to the floor. He heard the damp, tearing sound of her ruined dress falling away. "I am covered," Elara said after a few moments. Alaric turned around. Elara sat huddled in the chair. She had wrapped the large blanket tightly around her shoulders. Her wet clothes lay in a miserable heap on the floor. Alaric walked over and picked up the garments. He draped them over the back of an empty chair near the fire. As he reached past her, the blanket slipped slightly from her shoulder. Alaric froze. He saw thick, raised lines of scarred flesh across her collarbone. They disappeared down her back. They were old wounds. They were not made by blades in a war. They were made by whips and sticks. Someone had beaten a blind woman. A sudden surge of violent anger flagged in his chest. He clenched his jaw to stop himself from speaking. He forced his hands to relax. He reached out and gently pulled the blanket back over her shoulder. His leather gauntlet brushed against her cold skin. Elara flinched slightly. She pulled the wool up to her chin. "You have scars," Alaric stated plainly. He did not ask a question. He did not want to force her to speak. Elara stared blankly into the fire. "The streets are not kind to those who cannot see," she said. Her tone was matter-of-fact. She held no self-pity. People take what they want. They strike when they are angry. I learned to stay out of the way. Alaric stared at her profile. He had conquered 3 nations. He had executed lords and burned castles. He had always believed power was the only truth. Yet this fragile woman possessed a resilience he did not understand. She had been broken by the world. She still offered her last piece of bread to a stranger. A heavy knock sounded at the door. Elara jumped in her seat. "Enter," Alaric commanded. Captain Thorne opened the door carrying a wooden tray. He kept his eyes fixed firmly on the floor. He set the tray on a small table near the bed. "Hot stew and fresh bread, sire," Thorne reported. "Leave us," Alaric said. Thorne bowed and backed out of the room. The door closed with a soft thud. Alaric picked up the tray. He brought it over to the hearth. He placed it on the floor between them. He handed Elara a wooden bowl filled with thick stew. He pressed a carved spoon into her right hand. "Eat," he told her. Elara brought the bowl to her face. She inhaled the rich scent of meat and root vegetables. Tears suddenly welled in her blind eyes. She blinked them away quickly. She took a slow, careful bite. She closed her eyes as the warm food reached her stomach. Alaric watched her eat. He did not touch his own food. He felt an odd sense of satisfaction, just watching her regain her strength. "You do not, soldier?" Elara asked. She paused with her spoon in the air. "I am not hungry," Alaric lied. Elara lowered her bowl slightly. "You lied to me in the alley," she said. Her voice was calm but firm. Alaric leaned back against the stone wall. He crossed his arms over his breastplate. "What makes you say that?" he asked. "The man who brought the food called you sire," she pointed out. "And the tavern grew dead silent when you entered." She tilted her head toward him. "Soldiers do not command that kind of fear. Only kings do." Alaric remained silent. He waited for her to panic. He waited for her to fall out of the chair and beg for mercy. Alaric did neither. She simply took another bite of her stew. "Are you going to execute me for speaking out of turn?" she asked. A genuine smile tugged at the corner of Alaric's mouth. It was a rare expression on his scarred face. No, Alaric replied. Good, Alara said. She scraped the bottom of her wooden bowl. Because I still have half a loaf of bread to finish. Alaric let out a low, rumbling laugh. The sound startled even him. Alara smiled into the fire. The storm continued to batter the window shutters. Inside the room, the fire crackled warmly. Alaric realized he did not want to be anywhere else. He realized he wanted to keep this woman safe. He did not know why. He decided he did not need a reason. Alara finished the last bite of the hearty stew. She set the wooden bowl gently on the floor. Warmth spread quickly through her exhausted limbs. The heavy wool blanket felt like a shield against the cruel world. She leaned her head against the back of the wooden chair. Sleep claimed her almost instantly. Alaric remained seated quietly on the hard floor. He watched her breathing settle into a steady rhythm. The firelight cast dancing shadows across her scarred collarbone. He thought about the men who had hurt her in the past. A quiet fury simmered deep within his chest. He had wiped out entire rebel armies without a single second thought. Violence was the only language he truly understood. Yet violence could not heal the old wounds this woman carried. He reached slowly into his leather pouch. His fingers brushed against the small piece of stale bread. She had offered him her only means of survival. Nobody had ever given him a gift without a hidden blade attached. He pulled the bread out and held it in his broad palm. The rough crust felt heavy with unseen value. He placed it carefully back into the secure pouch. He decided in that moment he would keep it forever. The winter storm raged outside the tavern window for hours. Wind battered violently against the heavy wooden shutters. Alaric did not close his eyes to sleep. He kept the fire fed constantly with dry logs. He ensured the room stayed perfectly warm for her fragile form. Morning eventually broke through the cracks in the dark wood. The howling wind faded into an absolute and eerie silence. Pale sunlight filtered softly into the dim tavern room. Alara stirred slowly in the large chair. She pulled the thick blanket tighter around her delicate neck. She opened her blind eyes to the quiet morning air. "You are awake?" Alaric said. His deep voice broke the total silence of the room. Alara turned her head immediately toward the sound. "You stayed awake all night," she murmured. She sounded genuinely surprised by this simple fact. "I had nowhere else to be," Alaric replied evenly. He stood up tall and stretched his stiff muscles. His dark armor clinked softly with the slow movement. A heavy knock sounded suddenly at the oak door. Captain Thorne spoke loudly from the narrow hallway. "The horses are ready for the long march, sire." Alaric walked straight to the door and pulled it open. Thorne stood rigidly in the dark corridor. The captain looked nervously past Alaric into the warm room. He saw Alara sitting quietly by the dying hearth. "We march in 10 minutes, Alaric ordered. "Yes, sire," Thorne replied quickly. The captain hesitated for a brief and dangerous moment. "Shall I leave a silver coin with the fat innkeeper for the woman?" Thorne assumed the king was entirely finished with his momentary charity. Alaric stared at his captain with icy eyes. "Find a carriage," Alaric commanded. Thorne blinked twice in utter confusion. "A carriage, sire." "Find a sturdy carriage and line it with thick furs," Alaric repeated. His low voice held a very dangerous edge. "She is coming south with us." Thorne swallowed hard and nodded his head instantly. He did not dare question the absolute order. The captain turned and hurried down the wooden stairs. Alaric pushed the door closed. He walked calmly back toward the stone fireplace. Alara sat perfectly still in the large chair. She had heard the entire exchange through the open door. "I cannot travel with a marching army," she said quietly. "You will not walk in the mud," Alaric told her. I am just a blind beggar, she protested. I will only be a heavy burden to your swift men. Alaric stopped directly in front of her. You are not a burden. Where are you taking me? She asked. Her pale hands gripped the frayed edges of the blanket. To the capital, Alaric answered. You will have a warmed room and safe meals there. Nobody gives something for absolutely nothing, Alara whispered. Fear laced her quiet and trembling words. I have nothing left to give a king. Alaric thought warmly of the dry bread in his pouch. You have already paid your full fare, he said. He reached down and picked up her dry clothes from the empty chair. The ragged dress was ruined completely beyond repair. He tossed the useless rags aside. He puffed up his heavy winter cloak from the stone floor. He draped the massive garment gently over her thin shoulders. The thick wool swallowed her frail frame completely. He fastened the heavy iron clasp at her slender neck. Stand up, he instructed gently. Alara slowly pushed herself out of the wooden chair. Her bare legs were still weak from the previous day. She swayed slightly on her freezing feet. Alaric did not let her fall to the floor. He stepped forward and scooped her easily into his powerful arms. Alaric gasped loudly in sudden shock. She instinctively wrapped her thin arms around his armored neck. What are you doing now? She asked. The wooden stairs are steep, Alaric stated calmly. He carried her steadily toward the heavy door. She weighed significantly less than his steel broadsword. He carried her down the creaking wooden staircase. The tavernas filled with armed soldiers eating a morning meal. Total silence fell over the crowded room as the king appeared. Hundreds of wide eyes locked onto the strange sight. The ruthless warlord was carrying a bundled beggar woman. Alaric completely ignored their stunned stares. He walked straight through the silent room. He kicked the heavy front door wide open. Bright morning sunlight lit them instantly. The muddy street was covered in fresh white snow. The crisp winter air was sharp and clean. A wooden carriage stood waiting near the busy market square. 4 black war horses were harnessed firmly to the front. Captain Thorne stood quietly by the open carriage door. He kept his nervous eyes fixed firmly on the white snow. Alaric carried Alara quickly across the empty square. His heavy iron boots crunched loudly in the morning frost. He reached the carriage and gently set her inside. The interior wooden seats were covered in thick bear pelts. Alara sank deeply into the soft fur. She ran her cold fingers over the luxurious material. She had never felt anything so soft in her entire life. Alaric reached his long arms into the carriage. He tucked a thick wolfskin blanket warmly around her bare legs. You will stay warm in here today, he said. Alara reached out blindly and found his leather gauntlet. She held tightly onto his large hand for a passing second. Why are you doing this for me? She asked again. Alaric looked down at her cloudy blind eyes. He did not possess a simple answer for her. He only knew he could not leave her alone in the freezing mud. Because I choose to do so, he replied. He pulled his hand away and closed the wooden carriage door. The metal latch clicked firmly into its secure place. Alaric turned slowly to face his waiting army. 3,000 armed men stood in perfect military formation. They waited patiently for their quiet king to mount his massive horse. Alaric walked over to his huge black stallion. He grabbed the smooth saddle horn and pulled himself up. He settled heavily into the worn leather seat. He looked back briefly at the waiting wooden carriage. He signaled sharply for the lead driver to move forward. The massive army began its long march south. The rhythmic sound of heavy boots and iron hooves filled the cold air. Alara sat quietly inside the moving wooden carriage. The wooden wheels rattled noisily over the rough cobblestone streets. She pulled the fur blanket up to her pale chin. She could hear the heavy steps of the king's horse riding closely beside her window. The steady sound made her feel incredibly safe. She did not know what terrible things awaited her in the distant capital. She only knew the freezing alley was left behind her forever. Alaric rode silently beside the carriage. The bitter winter wind bit fiercely at his exposed face. He did not feel the freezing cold. His strategic mind was entirely focused on the long journey ahead. He had spent his brutal life destroying countless enemies. He had built his bloody throne entirely on raw fear and dead men. Now he was using his vast power to protect a broken, blind woman. The stark contrast did not bother his rational mind. It felt oddly like the first truly right thing he had done in 20 long years. The armed caravan left the quiet town borders behind. They entered the vast and dark pine forest. White snow fell gently from the heavy green branches. The journey back to the stone capital would take an entire week. Alaric swore silently that she would not suffer a single passing moment of it. He would gladly burn the whole world down before he let her fall again. The dark forest road was extremely narrow and deeply rutted. The carriage swayed dangerously as the wheels hit deep grooves in the frozen dirt. Alara gripped the wooden edge of the seat tightly. She was completely unaccustomed to riding in any kind of moving vehicle. Her miserable life had been confined to dirty alleyways and dark stable corners. The steady rocking motion made her empty stomach turn slightly. She focused intently on the sound of Alaric's massive horse. The heavy hoofbeats acted perfectly as a solid tether to her reality. Whenever the carriage jolted violently, the warhorse would step much closer to the window. Alaric was watching her painful progress carefully. He noticed how incredibly pale she looked through the small glass pane. He raised his armored hand and signaled the marching column to halt. The massive army ground to an immediate and noisy stop. Metal armor clanked and tired horses snorted in the crisp winter air. Alaric dismounted quickly and walked straight to the carriage door. He pulled it open and looked closely inside. Alara was clutching the fur pelts with stark white knuckles. "Are you ill?" he asked. "I am just not used to this rough movement," she admitted. She took a deep breath of the cold air rushing through the open door. "The constant rocking makes me terribly dizzy." Alaric evaluated the unfortunate situation. He could not simply order the massive army to march any slower. Fierce winter storms were gathering quickly behind them in the frozen north. They desperately needed to clear the high mountain pass before nightfall. "Come out," Alaric said. He reached his large hands warmly toward her. Alara hesitated briefly but uncurled her stiff fingers from the animal pelts. She leaned forward blindly into his waiting arms. Alara lifted her easily out of the wooden carriage. He carried her directly toward his massive black warhorse. The huge beast snorted loudly and tossed its heavy, dark head. Alara felt the warm breath of the strong animal against her cold legs. "What is happening now?" she asked nervously. "You will ride the horse with me," Alaric explained. He lifted her high into the cold air. He set her sideways carefully across the front of his wide leather saddle. He swung himself gracefully up and sat directly behind her. His large, muscular frame created a solid wall against her fragile back. He reached securely around her thin waist to grab the heavy leather reins. His strong arms formed a secure cage around her small body. "Hold onto the smooth saddle horn," he instructed. Alara found the worn word and gripped it tightly. Alaric nudged the black horse forward. The magnificent animal moved with a smooth and incredibly powerful gait. It completely lacked the jerky motion of the rattling wooden carriage. Alara relaxed her tense shoulders slowly against his broad chest. The steady warmth of his armored body seeped deeply into her cold back. She could feel the steady beating of his heart right through his dark tunic. The massive army resumed its march through the silent pine forest. Seasoned soldiers exchanged bewildered glances behind the king's broad back. They had never once seen their cruel ruler touch another person with such gentle care. Captain Thorne rode exactly 20 paces behind them. The loyal captain kept his mouth firmly shut and his eyes looking forward. He deeply understood that the world had fundamentally shifted today. The ruthless warlord had finally found something fragile to fiercely protect. Elara turned her pale face away from the biting wind. She tucked her chin safely into the thick wool of his warm cloak. The masculine scent of oiled leather and cold steel surrounded her completely. She closed her blind eyes and let the steady rhythm carry her safely south. Shadows lengthened across the snowy forest floor. The winter sun dipped behind the jagged peaks. Elara raised his hand to signal the halt. Thousands of marching boots stopped in unison. The sudden silence echoed through the ancient pines. Soldiers immediately broke formation to establish the night camp. Iron axes bit into fallen timber to build watchfires. Elara guided his horse toward a cleared circle of ground. His men had already erected the command tent. Heavy canvas snapped sharply in the Edenu wind. He pulled back on the leather reins. The horse came to a smooth stop. Alaric swung his leg over the saddle and dropped to the ground. His boots crushed the thin layer of ice. He turned and reached up toward Elara. She sat rigidly on the saddle horn. Her hands gripped the leather with white knuckles. "Release the horn," Elara told her. She let go and leaned forward blindly. He caught her waist and lifted her down. He set her feet gently on the cleared earth. Her legs buckled slightly after the long ride. Elara kept his hands firmly on her hips until she found her balance. "The ground is uneven here," he warned. "I can manage," Elara whispered. She kept one hand resting against his armored chest. He guided her toward the heavy canvas entrance. He pulled the tent flap aside. Heat radiated from an iron brazier burning in the center. Elara sighed as the warmth hit her frozen face. He led her to a folding cot covered in furs. "Sit," he instructed. She lowered herself onto the soft furs. She ran her fingers over the thick animal pelts. "You offer me too much comfort," she said. "I offer what is necessary," Alaric replied. He unbuckled his sword belt and set it on a wooden table. The heavy steel clattered against the wood. He removed his iron gauntlets and tossed them aside. A sudden gust of wind shook the canvas walls. The brazier flared and cast dancing shadows across her face. Alaric pulled a wooden chair close to the cot. He sat down and watched her navigate her new surroundings. She reached out to mat the edges of the bed. Her movements were slow and deliberate. She committed the small space to memory. Captain Thorne entered the tent carrying 2 metal plates. The smell of roasted meat filled the enclosed space. Thorne set the food on the table without speaking a word. He bowed his head and retreated quickly into the cold night. Alaric picked up a plate and handed it to Elara. He pressed a carved spoon into her palm. "Eat," he commanded gently. Elara found the edge of the plate with her thumb. She tasted the warm food with quiet gratitude. Alaric ate his own meal in silence. He studied the raised scars visible above her collar. He thought about the chaotic abyss of his kingdom. He had spent decades pulling order from that darkness. He had never considered the collateral damage of his wars. "You stare heavily," Elara noted. She stopped eating and tilted her head toward him. "I make no sound," Elara countered. "You do not need to make sound," she replied. She took another slow bite of her meal. "The air changes when a man watches intently." Alaric set his half-empty plate on the table. "I wonder about your eyes," he admitted. He did not apologize for his blunt words. Elara stopped chewing. She swallowed hard and lowered her spoon. "They were not always this way," she said softly. A tense silence stretched between them. The iron brazier popped and hissed in the quiet tent. "I lived in a border town near the western mountains," she continued. "A siege broke our walls during the spring thaw." Alaric knew that geography well. His own armies had marched through those valleys. "The fighting trapped us inside the cathedral," Ilara said. Her voice lacked any self-pity. "The roof caught fire from the flying pitch." She traced the edge of her plate with a trembling finger. A burning support beam collapsed near the altar. Alaric leaned forward in his chair. "The sparks and ash blinded you," he concluded. "The heat burned the sight from my eyes permanently," she corrected. She raised her head to face him. "The war took many things from our people. Sight was merely the price I paid to survive the flames." Alaric felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He remembered ordering the Western assault. He had demanded swift retribution against the rebel lords there. His sovereign decree had burned her town to ash. His ambition had plunged her into permanent darkness. He stared at his hands. Those hands had drawn the maps and signed the orders. "The king who ordered that siege was ruthless," Alaric stated. He wanted to gauge her hatred for him. "The king is a distant force," Ilara replied evenly. "We do not curse the winter storm for the snow. We simply try to find shelter." Her forgiveness felt heavier than any weapon. He preferred the simple honesty of a drawn sword. This quiet acceptance felt like a blade twisting in his chest. "You do not hate him?" Alaric asked. "Hatred requires energy I do not possess," she answered. She set her plate aside and folded her hands in her lap. "I spend my days searching for bread and warmth. Vengeance is a luxury for those with full stomachs." Alaric stood up from his chair. He paced across the small canvas room. He needed to move to contain his sudden fury. His malevolent anger was not directed at her. It was directed at his own past blindness. He had built a kingdom on the ashes of innocence. He had called it peace. He walked back to the cot and stood over her. Alara sensed his looming presence. She reached her hand out into the empty space between them. She sought reassurance from the darkness. Alaric took her hand in his best palm. His rough calluses scraped against her soft skin. He gripped her fingers with careful strength. "You will never search for bread again," he vowed. His voice carried the absolute authority of his throne. Alara smiled sadly. "You make promises you cannot keep," she whispered. "I keep every vow I make," Alaric said. He released her hand and stepped back. He walked over to the wooden table. He poured water from a clay jug into a metal cup. He brought the cup back to her. She drank the water slowly. The winter wind howled louder outside the tent. The canvas snapped violently against the wooden poles. "You should sleep," Alaric told her. "The march will resume at dawn." Alara lay back against the thick furs. She pulled a heavy blanket up to her chin. The warmth of the brazier seeped into her tired bones. She closed her sightless eyes. Alaric walked to the entrance flap. He tied the heavy canvas shut to block the draught. He returned to his wooden chair near the cot. He picked up a whetstone and his hunting dagger. He began to run the stone along the steel edge. The rhythmic scraping sound filled the tent. He knew the sound would ground her in reality. It would keep the nightmares of burning Tyrden away. Alara's breathing slowed into a steady rhythm. She slept soundly for the first time in years. Alaric watched her face relax in the dim light. He considered the long journey to the capital. The royal court was a nest of vipers. Lords and ministers constantly plotted for favor and power. They would see this fragile woman as a glaring weakness. They would try to use her to manipulate his decisions. He tightened his grip on the dagger handle. He would slaughter them all before they touched a single hair on her head. His kingdom had feared him for his endless cruelty. They were about to learn the true depth of his wrath. Protecting her would require a different kind of war. He welcomed the coming bloodshed. He set the sharpened dagger on the table. He leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. He did not sleep. He simply stood his quiet vigil in the dark. Dawn broke over the frozen camp with a bitter chill. The army prepared to move before the sun fully cleared the high peaks. Alaric wrapped Alara in his heaviest fur cloak before carrying her out. He lifted her effortlessly onto the back of his black warhorse. He climbed up behind her and secured her firmly against his chest. The march resumed through the dense and silent pine forest. The path grew steeper as they approached the northern mountain pass. Jagged stone cliffs rose sharply on both sides of the narrow trail. The wind howled aggressively through the deep, rocky canyon. Alara buried her face against the soft wool of his tunic. She could hear the tension in the shifting armor of the marching men. Soldiers marched closely together to block the biting wind. Captain Thorn rode slightly ahead to scout the treacherous path. The absolute silence of the canyon felt heavy and unnatural. Alaric tightened his strong arm around Alara's waist. His instincts screamed that something was terribly wrong. He scanned the snowy ridges with cold and calculating eyes. A single loose stone clattered down the steep cliff face. It was a tiny sound swallowed quickly by the howling wind. Alaric did not ignore it. He pulled back sharply on the heavy leather reins. His massive horse stopped instantly and stomped its iron hooves. He raised his right hand high into the freezing air. The entire marching column halted without a single word spoken. "What is happening?" Alara whispered nervously. She felt his muscles turn completely rigid beneath her cheek. "Stay perfectly still," Alara commanded in a low rumble. He reached down and unfastened the heavy iron clasp of his cloak. He threw the massive garment completely over her head and shoulders. The thick material plunged her into a dark and muffled world. She could only smell oiled leather and the faint scent of pine. A sharp whistling sound suddenly pierced the cold mountain air. Dozens of black arrows rained down from the high, rocky ridges. Rebel soldiers screamed their war cries from the hidden cliffs. The ambush had been perfectly timed for the narrowest part of the pass. They intended to trap the king and crush his royal guard. Arrows shattered uselessly against the heavy iron shields of the soldiers. Alaric did not flinch as death rained down around them. He kept his left arm wrapped tightly around Alara to shield her. He drew his heavy broadsword with a smooth and deadly motion. The dark steel hissed violently as it left the leather scabbard. 3 arrows flew directly toward his exposed chest. He swung his blade with unnatural speed. The metallic clash rang loudly over the chaos of the sudden ambush. The arrows splintered into harmless wood and fell to the snow. He did not wait for the enemy to reload in bows. He kicked his spurs hard into the flanks of his warhorse. The beast surged forward toward the base of the nearest cliff. "Thorn!" Alaric roared over the deafening noise. "Hold the center line." Thorn barked orders to the heavily armored infantry. Shield walls locked together with a massive crash of iron. Alaric ignored the rebel archers firing desperately from above. He focused on the rebel commander leading a charge down the slope. The man swung a heavy spiked mace with reckless fury. Alaric felt a dark and familiar power rise deep within his chest. It was the terrifying strength that had forged his bloody crown. He did not just defeat his enemies in battle. He broke their very spirits and erased them from existence. A heavy aura of absolute dread rolled off his broad shoulders. The air around him seemed to warp and darken with raw intent. He swung his sword in a wide and devastating arc. He did not bother aiming for the commando's vital spots. The sheer kinetic force of the blow shattered the man's heavy mace. The impact sent the rebel flying backward into the solid stone wall. The man crumpled to the ground without a single sound. No blood spilled onto the pure white snow. The sheer violence of the strike was enough to end the threat. Other rebels hesitated as they witnessed their leader fall so easily. They looked at the dark king sitting calmly on his black horse. They saw a malevolent force of nature rather than a mortal man. Alaric raised his dark sword toward the archers on the ridge. His voice boomed like thunder through the narrow canyon. "You challenge the abyss," he shouted. His dark aura flared with intense and suffocating pressure. The rebels on the ridge dropped their weapons in sheer terror. Some turned and fled blindly into the treacherous snowdrifts. Others fell to their knees and covered their ears in despair. The fight was completely over before it had truly begun. Alaric lowered his weapon slowly. He breathed deeply to rein in the violent storm inside his mind. He forced the deadly aura to recede into the dark corners of his soul. The canyon grew deathly quiet once again. The only sound was the heavy breathing of tired men and horses. Alaric slid his broadsword smoothly back into its sheath. He immediately dropped the terrifying persona of the sovereign warlord. He turned his entire focus back to the small bundle in his arms. Alara was shaking violently beneath the heavy wool cloak. She had heard the terrible sounds of clashing steel and screaming men. She had felt the unnatural cold of his dark power washing over them. Alaric gently pulled the heavy fabric away from her pale face. She gasped for fresh air and kept her blind eyes squeezed shut. She clutched fiercely at the front of his tunic. "It is over," Alaric said softly. His voice was entirely devoid of the wrath he had just unleashed. It was smooth and calm. Alara slowly opened her sightless eyes to the cold wind. "I heard arrows," she whispered. "They did not reach us," he assured her. He smoothed a tangled lock of hair away from her cold cheek. He checked her carefully for any sign of injury or distress. She was completely untouched by the violence. Not a single drop of dirt had soiled her new clothes. She felt his large hand resting gently against her face. The terrifying conqueror had shielded her from the brutal reality of his world. "You killed them," she stated quietly. "I removed a threat," Alaric corrected. He did not want her to associate him only with mindless death. He wanted her to know he fought only to keep their path clear. "You are safe here," he promised. Alara leaned her head against his armored chest. She listened to the steady and calming rhythm of his heart. It did not race with the adrenaline of the recent battle. It beat with slow and absolute certainty. "I believe you," she finally said. Captain Thorne rode slowly up to the side of the black horse. The captain surveyed the broken weapons scattered across the snow. He looked at the fleeing rebels disappearing over the high ridges. He then looked at his king, holding the blind woman with impossible care. Thorne realized he had fundamentally misunderstood the situation. This was not a temporary act of passing charity. The king had not just adopted a fragile pet for his amusement. He had found an anchor for his dark and restless soul. Thorne swallowed hard and bowed his head respectfully. "The path is entirely clear, sire," Thorne reported quietly. He kept his voice low to avoid startling the terrified woman. "Clear the debris and resume the march," Alaric ordered. He did not even look at his loyal captain. His eyes remained fixed solely on Alara's calm face. The army began to move forward through the snowy pass. The soldiers stepped carefully around the shattered wooden weapons. They cast nervous glances toward the king and his quiet passenger. They all understood the unspoken new law of the kingdom. The blind woman was completely untouchable. To threaten her was to invite the absolute destruction of the king. The journey through the rest of the mountain pass was uneventful. The rebel forces did not dare to strike again. They had witnessed the true cost of challenging the sovereign. Alaric rode in silence for the remainder of the long afternoon. He kept his arms securely locked around Alara to ward off the cold. The mountains eventually gave way to the rolling southern foothills. The snow began to thin as they reached lower elevations. The bitter wind lost its sharp and freezing edge. Alara relaxed fully against his strong frame. She fell into a light and peaceful sleep as they rode. Alaric watched the distant towers of the capital city rise on the horizon. The ancient stone structures pierced the gray winter sky. It was a place of endless political games and hidden daggers. He had ruled that dark city with an iron fist for 20 years. He knew exactly what awaited them behind those massive iron gates. He tightened his grip slightly on the leather reins. He would clear a safe path for her through the treacherous court. He would burn the ancient traditions down if they stood in his way. She would never sleep in a freezing stable again. She would never beg for a single scrap of dry bread. He would place her high above the reach of those who would harm her. He would teach the world to bow to the woman who could not see it. The iron gates of the capital city loomed ahead. Stone walls stretched toward the winter sky. Horns blasted from the high watchtowers to signal the arrival. The heavy sound vibrated through the cold air. Alara stirred against the leather armor of her protector. She lifted her head from his chest. The noise of a massive population surrounded them. Thousands of voices merged into a low hum. She gripped the saddle horn with nervous fingers. Alaric placed his hand over hers. His touch offered silent reassurance. The black warhorse marched onto the paved city streets. Citizens lined the wide avenues to see the returning army. They threw winter blooms onto the frozen stones. Their cheers turned into confused murmurs as the king passed. People pointed at the bundle of fur on his saddle. They saw the pale face of a stranger. Rumors ignited before the horses even reached the inner keep. Alara shrank back against his tunic. "There are so many people," she whispered. "They do not matter," Alaric replied. He kept his gaze fixed on the castle ahead. The procession crossed the deep moat. Iron chains rattled as the drawbridge secured their path. They entered the sprawling royal courtyard. Hundreds of nobles waited near the marble steps. They wore bright silks and heavy jewels. Their practiced smiles faded into expressions of shock. No monarch had ever returned with a peasant in his arms. Alaric pulled back on the leather reins. The warhorse came to a precise halt. Soldiers quickly formed a defensive perimeter around their sovereign. Captain Thorne dismounted and stepped forward to hold the bridle. Alaric ignored the waiting dignitaries. He did not wait for the wooden stepping block. He swung his leg over the saddle. He dropped to the stone courtyard with Alara held taut. His boots hit the ground with a heavy thud. The sound echoed across the silent square. Alara buried her face in the thick wool of his cloak. She felt exposed, despite the heavy layers. The scent of expensive perfumes and roasted meats filled her nose. It was a sharp contrast to the smell of dirt and rain she knew. Lord Vance stepped out from the crowd of nobles. The minister held a scroll of parchment in his ringed hand. He bowed low before the king. His eyes darted quickly to the blind woman. Disgust flickered briefly across his powdered face. "Welcome home, sire," Vance said loudly. "The council has prepared a feast in your honor." Alaric did not stop walking. He carried Alara straight toward the marble steps. Vance shifted his weight to block the path. It was a foolish and fatal miscalculation. "Sire, the court awaits your report on the rebellion," the minister pressed. He gestured toward the open doors of the great hall. "Perhaps the servants can take this distraction to the kitchens." The courtyard went deathly quiet. Even the war horses stopped shifting on the stones. Alaric paused on the first marble step. He turned his head slowly to look at Vance. A terrifying shadow seemed to fall over the king's face. The air grew heavy and suffocating. Alara felt his muscles turn to granite beneath her hands. She recognized the dangerous shift in his demeanor. It was the same dark presence from the mountain pass. "What did you call her?" Alaric asked. His voice barely rose above a whisper. It carried clearly to the back of the silent crowd. Vance swallowed hard. Sweat beaded on the minister's forehead despite the cold wind. "I merely meant the woman requires bathing, sire." The noble tried to salvage his ruined position. "The royal halls are no place for a vagrant." Alaric shifted Alara slightly in his arms. He ensured her head rested comfortably against his shoulder. He took one step down toward the trembling minister. "You have served the crown for 10 years, Alaric stated. Vance nodded frantically. "I have, sire." "Your service ends today," Alaric declared. The words fell like a physical blow. Vance dropped his parchment to the ground. "My king, please," the man begged. "You breathe because I allow it," Alaric continued. He projected his sovereign authority over the entire assembly. "If you ever speak of her again, I will remove your tongue." He did not raise his voice. He did not draw his steel sword. The pure menace in his tone brought Vance to his knees. The former initiator leapt into the cold stones. Other nobles took several steps back in sheer terror. They realized the rules of power had fundamentally changed. The king had found a singular weakness. He had turned that weakness into an untouchable monument. Alaric turned away from the sobbing man. He carried Alara up the long marble staircase. Guards rushed to open the heavy oak doors. The king walked into the grand foyer. Tapestries lined the high stone walls. Heat radiated from massive hearths placed between the pillars. Alara relaxed her death grip on his tunic. "You ruined that man," Shwajuthed quietly. "He offended me," Alaric replied. "He spoke the truth about my station," she pointed out. "I am a vagrant." Alaric stopped in the center of the hall. He looked down at her cloudy eyes. "Your station is whatever I decide it is." He resumed his determined march through the castle. Servants bowed their heads and pressed themselves against the walls. Nobody dared to look directly at the strange pair. Alaric bypassed the throne room entirely. He ignored the council chambers and the dining halls. He carefully toward the Traverteville wing. 2 elite guards stood outside large diamond-bound doors. They slammed their spears against the floor in salute. One guard quickly unlocked the head's doors. Alaric stepped into his personal sanctuary. The chambers were vast and Spartan. Weapons hung on the dark stone walls. A massive bed dominated the far side of the room. Thick rugs covered the cold floors. He walked over to a wide padded bench near the fire. He set her down with extreme care. Alara sank into the velvet cushions. She reached out to touch the soft fabric. "Where are we?" she asked. "My chambers," Alaric answered. He unclasped his heavy outer cloak and threw it over a chair. Alara tilted her head in confusion. "Why bring me here?" "Because nobody enters this room without my permission." He walked over to a wooden table and poured wine into a silver goblet. "You are safe behind these doors." Alavir pulled her feet up onto the bench. She wrapped her arms around her knees. "I do not belong in a place like this." Her voice carried a note of deep sorrow. "I cannot even see the wealth around me." Alara carried the goblet back to her. He pressed the cold silver into her hands. "The wealth is meaningless," he told her. "I conquered cities to amass gold. None of it ever bought me a moment of peace." He pulled a chair close and sat down. You gave me a piece of bread in the mud. That held more value than this entire fortress. Alara took a slow sip of the rich wine. The sweet liquid burned slightly on her tongue. She felt the overwhelming gravity of his protection. It was a heavy mantle to wear. She had spent her life trying to remain invisible. Now the most powerful man in the world had placed her in the center of his domain. They will hate me, Alara said. The nobles in the courtyard. They will scheme against you because of me. Alaric leaned forward and rested his elbows on his knees. Let them plot, he said darkly. I have grown bored of their predictable games. If they cross the line, I will burn their houses to the ground. His promise of violent retribution was chilling, yet it made her feel incredibly secure. She reached out her free hand toward his voice. Her fingers found the scarred leather of his vambrace. She traced the deep scratches in the armor. You are a terrifying man, she murmured. Only to those who threaten you, Alaric replied. He covered her hand with his own. His touch was surprisingly warm. A soft knock interrupted the quiet moment. Alaric stood up and walked to the doors. He opened them just enough to look out. An older woman stood nervously in the hall. She carried a bundle of clean silk garments. The head maid, sire, the woman whispered. I brought clothes for the lady. Alaric opened the door wider and let her inside. Draw a hot bath, he ordered. Use the copper tub in the adjacent room. The maid nodded and scurried toward the washroom. Alara walked back to Alara. The servants will help you bathe, he explained. They will discard those ruined clothes. Alara touched the frayed edge of her dirty sleeve. I have worn this dress for 3 years. It is time to leave the past behind, Alara said. He watched the maid carry buckets of steaming water into the next room. The scent of lavender soap drifted into the main chamber. I will wait outside, he promised. No one else will enter. Alara nodded slowly. She trusted his absolute vow. Alaric stepped out into the stone hallway. He closed the heavy oak doors behind him. He leaned his broad back against the wood. He crossed his arms and stared at the terrified guards. They kept their eyes fixed straight ahead. They knew better than to acknowledge the king's unusual behavior. Inside the room, Alara allowed the maid to guide her. The hot water washed away weeks of frozen mud. The soap smelled of summer gardens she had long forgotten. The maid scrubbed her tangled hair with gentle hands. She dried her with soft linen towels. She helped Alara into a dress of spun blue silk. The fabric felt as light as air against her scarred skin. The maid left the room with the bucket of dirty water. Alara walked slowly back into the main chamber. She guided herself along the edge of the large bed. She sat near the fire and waited. Alaric returned a few moments later. He paused just inside the doorway. The firelight caught the soft blue fabric of her new gown. Her damp hair hung in clean waves over her shoulders. The dirt was gone. Only the faded scars remained as proof of her suffering. He felt a sharp ache in his chest. It was a foreign sensation for a man built for war. He walked over and sat in the wooden chair beside her. The silk suits you, he finally said. Alara smoothed her hands over her lap. It feels fragile, she admitted. I am afraid I will tear it. I will buy you 1,000 more, Alaric replied. He meant every word. The treasury of the kingdom belonged to her now. She simply did not know it yet.
He intended to spend the rest of his life proving it to her.
Alaric watched the firelight dance across the silk fabric of her dress. A heavy bell chimed from the high tower outside. It signaled the beginning of the victory feast. He despised these mandatory celebrations. Lords and ministers would spend hours flattering his military successes while plotting behind their wine glasses. "You must attend the hall," Alara said quietly. She tilted her head toward the distant sound of the iron bell. "I can wait here until you return." Alaric stood up from the wooden chair. "I will not leave you alone in this wing." "The guards are stationed directly outside," she pointed out. "I trust my guards to fight," Alaric replied. He walked over to a heavy wooden trunk at the foot of the bed. "I do not trust them to prevent the subtle venom of the court from reaching you." He opened the heavy lid and searched inside. "They will stare at me," Alara whispered. Her hands gripped the folds of her blue dress. "I cannot see their faces, but I will feel their judgment." "Let them judge," Alaric said firmly. He pulled a thick velvet cloak from the trunk. "Their opinions carry less weight than dust." He brought the warm cloak over to her. He draped the heavy velvet carefully around her shoulders. "You will sit at my right side." Alara gasped slightly. "That place is reserved for a queen." "That place belongs to whomever I choose to place there," Alaric stated. He fastened the silver clasp beneath her chin. "I will not hide you in the shadows like a shameful secret." "You saved my life in the mud." "I intend to honor that debt in the light." He offered his arm to her. Alara hesitated for a brief second before reaching out. Her fingers wrapped securely around his muscular forearm. She felt the rough leather of his tunic beneath her skin. They walked slowly out of the private chambers. The two elite guards snapped to attention. Alaric led her down the long stone corridor. Torches flickered along the high walls and cast long shadows across the floor. The noise of the great hall grew louder with every step they took. Music and laughter echoed through the vast castle. They reached the massive oak doors of the dining hall. 4 heralds stood ready with polished brass horns. Alaric gave them a single sharp nod. The horns blared a deafening note to announce his arrival. The heavy doors swung inward on well-oiled hinges. The grand hall was ablaze with hundreds of wax candles. Long wooden tables stretched across the expansive room. The laughter stopped instantly. Silence crashed down upon the gathered nobility like a falling stone. Hundreds of eyes locked onto him and his unusual companion. Alaric guided Alara forward with slow and deliberate steps. He did not look at any of the seated lords. He kept his entire focus on navigating the clear path for her. Alara kept her chin raised despite her overwhelming fear. She concentrated entirely on the steady rhythm of Alaric's breathing beside her. They reached the raised dais at the end of the room. A long table sat upon the wooden platform. 2 heavy carved chairs rested directly in the center. Alaric pulled the right chair out with his free hand. He guided Alara into the padded seat. He pushed the chair forward until she was comfortable. Only then did he sit in his own high-backed seat. The nobles remained standing in frozen silence. "Sit," Alaric commanded. The single world echoed out a vaulted ceiling. Chairs scraped loudly against the stone floor as the entire room obeyed. Servants immediately began to pour wine and serve roasted meats. The quiet chatter slowly resumed. It was strained and nervous. Alara cupped her hands folded neatly in her lap. She felt a warm plate being placed in front of her. Alaric leaned close to her ear. "There is sliced pheasant and fresh bread on your plate," he murmured. "The wine goblet is by your right hand." "Thank you," she replied softly. She reached out and found the edge of the silver cup. The feast progressed with painful awkwardness. Nobles offered hollow toasts to his recent victory. Alaric acknowledged them with curt nods. He spent more time ensuring Alara had enough food.
Envoy Kale stood up from a table near the front. He represented a wealthy nation across the Eastern Sea. His silk robes rustled loudly as he raised a golden cup. "To the sovereign," Kale announced. His voice carried a smooth and practiced arrogance. "Your armies have pacified the savage north." Alaric rested his hands flat on the wooden table. He watched the envoy with cold eyes. "We marvel at your strength, sire," Kale continued. The man took a slow step closer to the raised dais. "Though we are surprised by your new taste in spoils." The entire hall went completely dead.
Servants stopped pouring wine and froze in place. Kale smiled a thin and venomous smile. "Usually a conqueror claims gold or royal hostages. It seems our king prefers to collect broken things from the dirt." Alara stiffened in her heavy chair. Her face drained of all color. She knew the insult was meant to diminish Alaric's authority. She was merely the convenient weapon the envoy chose to use. Alaric did not yell. He did not draw the dagger at his belt. He picked up his own solid iron cup. He stood up slowly from his seat. His massive frame towered over the entire assembly. The oppressive weight of his anger filled the room instantly. It was a physical pressure that made it difficult to breathe. "Come closer, Kale," Alaric said softly. The quiet tone was infinitely more terrifying than a shout. Kale hesitated. The envoy's arrogant smile faltered slightly. He took 2 reluctant steps forward to stand directly below the dais. "You speak of broken things," Alaric said. He stared down at the foreign diplomat. "You think you understand value because you wear expensive silk." Alaric squeezed the iron cup in his right hand. The thick metal began to groan under the immense pressure. "You view this woman as a flaw in my armor. You view her as a weakness to be exploited." The iron cup crumpled completely in his grip. Dark wine spilled over his knuckles like fresh blood. He tossed the ruined metal onto the stone floor. It clattered loudly in the absolute silence. "She is not my weakness," Alaric declared. He looked out over the sea of terrified faces. "She is my sovereign boundary." He turned his gaze back to the trembling envoy. "She represents the absolute limit of my mercy." Alaric stepped down from the dais. He closed the distance between himself and Kale in 2 long strides. The envoy dropped his golden cup in sheer panic. Kale tried to step back but tripped over his own silk robes. He fell hard onto his knees. Alaric stood over the pathetic man. "If any person in this hall disrespects her again," Alaric promised, "I will not simply take their life. I will erase their family name from history. I will salt their lands so nothing ever grows there again." He leaned down closer to Kale's face. "Do you understand the value of this broken thing now?" Kale nodded frantically. Tears of genuine terror streamed down his face. "Yes, sire," the envoy choked out. "I understand completely." "Leave my city before sunrise," Alaric ordered. He turned his back on the weeping diplomat. He walked back up the wooden steps of the dais. He sat down beside Alara and picked up a linen napkin. He calmly wiped the spilled wine from his hand. The hall remained paralyzed by shock. "The feast is over," Alaric announced. He did not raise his voice. "Leave us." The nobles scrambled to obey the sudden command. Chairs overturned in their desperate haste to escape the room. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind the fleeing crowd. Only the crackling fires remained to break the silence. Alaric turned his chair slightly to face Alara. She sat perfectly still with her hands trembling in her lap. "They are gone," he told her gently. Alara took a deep and shaking breath. You threaten to destroy entire families because of a few words. Words are the beginning of treason, Alaric said. If I allow them to speak poorly of you, they will eventually act. He reached out and covered her shaking hands with his own. I will never allow them to act. Ilara felt a strange mixture of terror and absolute awe. She had lived her whole life cowering from cruel men. Now the most dangerous man alive was using his cruelty as a shield for her. You called me your boundary, she whispered. You are, Alaric confirmed. He traced the faint scar on her collarbone with a gentle thumb. My life has been nothing but endless war and ambition. I pushed outward until there was nothing left to conquer. He looked at her blind eyes. You gave me a reason to stop. You gave me something to protect. Ilara realized the truth in his steady heartbeat. He was not holding her captive. He had anchored himself to her quiet strength. She leaned forward and rested her forehead against his shoulder. She did not care about the terrifying things he had done in the past. She only cared about the unbreakable safety she found in his arms. Alaric wrapped his arms tightly around her small frame. He buried his face in her clean hair. The vast dining hall felt empty and cold around them. He did not notice the chill at all. He had finally found his home. Winter slowly surrendered its grip on the stone capital. Melting snow rushed noisily through the deep iron gutters. Months had passed since the terrifying feast in the Great Hall. True peace settled over the royal wing for the first time in history. Ilara learned to navigate the private chambers with quiet confidence. Her bare feet memorized every thick rug and carved wooden threshold. She no longer woke up trembling in the middle of the night. The lingering fear of starvation had finally left her mind completely. She ate warm, roasted meats and fresh fruit every single day. The rich food filled out her hollow cheeks and restored her strength. Servants no longer shrank away in absolute terror when she passed. They offered warm smiles and gentle assistance instead. They brought her fresh flowers from the royal greenhouses. They brushed her hair until it shone like dark silk. Nobody dared to speak a single harsh word against her. Alaric's dark promise hung heavily over the entire court. Ministers walked softly and measured their ambitious words carefully. The king himself had fundamentally changed his brutal nature. His sword remained locked safely inside its leather scabbard. He spent his mornings reading petitions instead of planning new sieges. Ilara often sat quietly by the lodge-arched window. Warm spring sunlight bathed her scarred face in golden light. She listened to the scratch of his quill pen on thick parchment. That simple sound brought her an immense sense of security. She spent hours tracing the elaborate embroidery of her new gowns. Life had transformed into a gentle and predictable rhythm. She never had to worry about where her next meal would come from. She never had to shiver in the freezing darkness of an empty stable. The nightmares of burning timbers slowly began to fade away. His steady breathing next to her in the dark always kept the ghosts at bay. "You are signing many papers today," she remarked softly. She turned her head toward his heavy wooden desk. Alaric paused his writing and set the quill down. "I am drafting new laws for the outer provinces," he replied. He pushed the stack of decrees toward the edge of the desk. "Taxes on grain will be reduced before the summer harvest. Orphanages will receive direct funding from the royal treasury. Widows will be granted protection from aggressive debt collectors." Ilara smiled and rested her hands in her lap. A fierce warlord was using his immense power to feed starving children. "The council ministers will likely complain about the cost," she warned. "Let them complain," Alaric stated calmly. He stood up and walked across the carpeted floor. "Their complaints matter very little to me now." He stopped behind her chair and rested his hands on her shoulders. His lodged thumbs traced gentle circles against her silk dress. They must learn that the strength of a kingdom is not just in its iron. It lies in how it treats the most vulnerable within its walls. Alara leaned her head back against his sturdy chest. "You have changed," she whispered truthfully. "I have awakened," he corrected gently. He leaned down and kissed the top of her head. "I have decided we are leaving the capital tomorrow." Alara tilted her head back in genuine surprise. "Where are we going?" she asked. "North," he answered simply. He did not offer any further explanation. Preparations for the royal journey began immediately at dawn. The caravan was significantly smaller than the previous marching army. Only 50 elite guards accompanied the royal carriage. Captain Thorne rode proudly at the front of the column. The captain had become a fiercely loyal protector of the blind woman. He personally inspected every horse and wagon for strict safety. Alara did not ride inside the wooden vehicle this time. She sat confidently on the black warhorse with Alaric. Spring wildflowers bloomed brightly along the Daunt road. The air smelled incredibly sweet and full of new life. They traveled slowly and enjoyed the peaceful passing days. The harsh winter winds were entirely gone. Gentle breezes rustled the green leaves of the ancient pines. Alara leaned comfortably against his broad, armored chest. She felt completely secure within his straw embrace. They camped in the fragrant forests under clear, starry skies. Alara sat by the fire with her every single evening. He described the changing landscape to her in low tones. He painted pictures of deep valleys and rushing rivers with his words. She listened with rapt attention and a joyful heart. The journey felt like an extended and beautiful dream. They reached the familiar northern town of Oakhaven after a week. This was the exact place where she had fallen in the freezing mud. The memory of that bitter cold seemed like a distant nightmare now. Townspeople gathered along the dry streets to watch them arrive. They did not kneel in absolute terror this time. Curiosity replaced their deep-seated fear of the sovereign. Children chased the rolling wheels of the supply wagons. Merchants waved colorful banners from their wooden stalls. The atmosphere was vibrant and full of genuine hope. Alara guided the warhorse toward the center of the bustling market. He bypassed the old tavern entirely. They stopped in front of a massive new stone building. Freshly cut timber framed the wide open windows. "We have arrived," Alaric announced quietly. He dismounted smoothly and reached up to help her down. His strong hands gripped her waist with familiar care. Alara found her footing on the solid stone walkway. "I do not recognize these smells," she noted. "I smell fresh baked bread and clean linen." She reached out and felt the smooth surface of an iron gate. "What is this place?" Alaric placed his hand gently over hers. "This is the new royal sanctuary," he explained. "I ordered its construction the day we left this town." He guided her slowly through the wide iron gates. "It is a shelter for those who cannot survive the winter alone. The blind, the crippled, and the forgotten will find safety here." Alara stopped walking and took a sharp breath. Tears instantly welled in her sightless eyes. She realized he had built a fortress to protect people just like her. "You did all of this?" she whispered. Her voice broke with overwhelming emotion. "I merely provided the gold," Alaric replied. He wiped a stray tear from her cheek with his rough thumb. "You provided the reason." He led her inside the spacious main hall. Dozens of warm hearths crackled cheerfully along the walls. Soft voices murmured in quiet gratitude throughout the building. An elderly woman approached them with hesitant steps. "Bless you, my lord," the woman said in a frail voice. "We have a warm bed and hot soup every night now." Alaric nodded politely to the grateful resident. "The sanctuary belongs to the people," he told her. He turned his full attention back to Alara. Alara felt a tremendous weight lift entirely from her soul. The suffering she had endured here was finally rewritten. The horrible alleyway where she nearly died was now a place of healing. She reached out and touched his face tenderly. "You have a good heart beneath all that steel," she smiled. "My heart belongs entirely to you," he replied without hesitation. Alaric stopped in the very center of the grand room. He turned her gently to face him. "I conquered half the known world with fire and steel," he said. His deep voice resonated with absolute sincerity. "I thought fear was the only way to establish true order." He took both of her hands in his. "Then a starving woman offered me her last piece of bread. You shattered my entire worldview with a single act of kindness." Alara squeezed his large fingers tightly. "You were freezing in the dark," she reminded him softly. "Anyone would have offered help." "No," Alaric corrected firmly. "Only you did." He let go of her left hand and reached into his belt pouch. He pulled out a small and crumbling object. He pressed it gently into her open palm. Alara felt the hard crust of a very old piece of bread. She gasped as the profound realization hit her. "You kept it," she cried out softly. "I kept the most valuable thing I own," he confessed. He slowly lowered himself onto one knee. The metal joints of his armor clanked loudly against the floor. The entire hall immediately fell silent. Residents and guards turned to watch the unbelievable sight. The most feared king in history was kneeling before a blind commoner. Alara reached down frantically to find his shoulders. "What are you doing?" she panicked slightly. "You cannot kneel on the floor." "I bowed to no one for 20 years, Alara stated clearly. He looked up at her pale and beautiful face. "I broke that vow the day I pulled you from the mud." He reached back into his pouch and pulled out a velvet box. "I wish to break it properly today." He opened the box to reveal an ancient gold ring set with a single ruby. "This belonged to my mother. She was the last gentle thing I knew before the world turned cold. I offer you my crown, my armies, and my life." His words echoed with absolute and terrifying devotion. "Be my queen, Alara. Let me spend the rest of my days keeping you warm." Tears streamed freely down her scarred cheeks. She did not care about the crown or the massive armies. She only cared about the steadfast man holding her hands. "I cannot offer you royal blood or political alliances," she wept. "I can only offer you my heart. That is the territory I want to conquer," Alara swore. He waited patiently for her final answer. Alara nodded her head with absolute certainty. "Yes," she sobbed happily. "I will be your wife." Alara stood up and wrapped his arms fiercely around her. He lifted her completely off the stone floor. He buried his face in her neck and breathed in her sweet scent. A massive cheer erupted from the watching crowd. Joyful applause filled the sanctuary hall. Captain Thorne wiped a sudden tear from his own hardened eye. The royal guards slammed their spears against the floor in unified respect. Alara finally sat her back down on her feet. He slid the heavy gold ring onto her left hand. The warm metal felt incredibly heavy and real. He leaned down and kissed her softly on the lips. It was a promise sealed in silent understanding. The brutal warlord had finally found his ultimate peace. The broken beggar had found her indestructible shield. They walked back out into the bright spring sunlight together. The world outside remained complicated and occasionally dangerous. Storms would inevitably come again to test their resolve. Enemies would constantly probe the borders of their kingdom. None of those distant threats mattered to them anymore. Alara held tightly to the arm of the Alpha King. She could not see the massive empire he ruled. She did not need eyes to see the truth. She felt the boundless depth of his love in every breath he took. He had built a safe world exclusively for her. She intended to live in it forever. Sometimes, the armor that can truly withstand an army is never cold steel, but the ultimate tenderness that someone would fight to the death to protect in their heart. If Alaric and Ella's story touched you, remember to subscribe. Share your thoughts in the comments section, and also leave a message about where you are right now, so I can see where the night sky is tonight, accompanying you through this story of mutual redemption. See you in the next story.